Welcome back to another episode of Conduct Detrimental. I'm your host today, Taryn Sharma, and I'm here with our friend, recurring guest, Sam Ehrlich. We're here to talk about the biggest news in college sports in a long time, and that's really saying something because it feels like every day there's been something big, but this is something that we've been tracking for a long time. And if you're on social media and you've been following anyone, you should be following Sam because he's done a great job breaking down every piece as this comes through. But late on Friday night, Judge Wilkin, Northern District of California, approved the House settlement. And so college sports is forever changed. We have a totally new model. And so Sam is here to help us break it all down. How's it going, Sam?
I'm going well. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for the kind words, Darren.
Yeah, we were waiting, I think, a little bit longer than maybe we thought. Can you remind people, first of all, kind of what the last sticking points were and why maybe we didn't get the approval back in April when we got the preliminary?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. We had a final approval hearing back on April 7th, and I think a lot of the attitudes, a lot of the opinions, a lot of the at least a good amount of kind of the pontificating about kind of the settlement was going to be that we're going to get a clear answer on April 7th or about April 7th. And even I thought I would have been very surprised to see it go into May. Well, it didn't get approved until June 6th, which is definitely not April, definitely not May, almost 2 months to the day from the final approval hearing for us to finally get a decision. But it really did turn on kind of one of the kind of more overlooked or initially overlooked parts of the settlement, the roster limits, which ended up being a huge sticking point for a lot of objectors. Out of the hundreds of objectors who issued statements and filed letters and really very emotionally plead out to Judge Wilkin to do something about it. Most of them, almost all of them, were related to roster limits. And Judge Wilkin had asked the parties kind of at the final approval hearing to do something about that. The parties came back a week later and were like, yeah, we're not really going to do anything. And then she came back again and said, well, try harder. And they did come back and kind of give a proposal to that. A lot of people, including myself, frankly, thought it wasn't enough, but it was enough for Judge Wilkin eventually.
Yeah, we'll definitely want to touch on what ultimately that final agreement was, but it got so serious when they came back to the point where she asked the objectors' representatives to be kind of part of that discussion and give final sign-off before she was going to agree.
She did, and that's a pretty interesting move from her. That's something where I'm sure the party's attorneys who have spent so much time on this, so much time in the same room hashing it out with their mediator, Professor Green, and kind of working on the table of this, all of a sudden you have a few more parties to try to accommodate. It gets to be a very complicated negotiation, and it as it turned out, it didn't end up being a very productive negotiation, but Judge Wilkin did end up taking the side of the parties over the objectors who were not particularly thrilled with the final outcome on that issue.
Yeah. And so you mentioned the negotiation. Here's where they finally came down generally, the framework. $2.8 billion in back pay. That's for former Division I athletes dating back to 2016 for that 8-year period through 2024. And a new 10-year settlement period, which is designed to provide compensation and regulate athlete pay directly from the universities. So the schools are going to be able to, they're not required to, but they're able to spend up to approximately $20.5 million annually. And that revenue is going directly to student athletes. And that number is required to increase at least 4% every year. And Ross Bjork, the Ohio State athletic director, was quoted as saying that he thinks that number is going to be past $25 million by the time they do the recalculation in 4 years. There are also exceptions to that. Some $2.5 million in additional scholarships can lower that annual cap. And then, so that's just the money aspect of it. Then we've got the creation of the College Sports Commission, which I definitely want to hear your thoughts about because this is the most detail we've received on this. The NIL Go platform, kind of a clearinghouse that Deloitte is going to be running based off of a model that they built for payments over $600. We mentioned the roster caps, which ultimately was the sticking point at the end. And then in parcel with that, the designated student athletes category. These are the individuals who, based on our understanding, are going to be grandfathered in, so the roster limits are not going to affect them, right?
Well, I think that's actually the sticking point and kind of the divide between the objectors and the parties, because you use the wording, these designated student athletes are the ones who are going to have to be grandfathered, and that's actually not the case. The way it works out, the way this designated student athletes label works is that any athlete who either was on a 24-25 roster, but was cut due to roster limits, or any incoming athlete, so a high school senior who's about to enter college, who was told that they'd have a roster spot, but would have that roster spot taken away due to the roster limits, they're considered to be a designated student athlete. They're given this label, or at least they will be given this label by their schools, who are going to submit a list of athletes who kind of fit these two categories. And then these athletes do not count against the roster caps, which, it's a good thing. It makes them very valuable. It makes them, essentially a free person to have on a roster spot. The issue, though, and this is something that the NCAA was very adamant about and really kind of ended up being the sticking point between them and the objectors, they want to ensure that the schools retain the autonomy to be able to decide who's on the roster and who's not on the roster. So they were very against the idea of mandatory grandfathering, where the athletes, for these designated student athletes, would have to be able to keep their spots. They could elect at their interest or at their will to stay on a roster instead of the school allowing them to do it. So the overall goal, and this, I think any of the objectors would kind of use this kind of language. It really leaves a lot to the schools. It really puts the schools in a position where they are essentially expected to act in good faith, or expected to act, kind of in a good way, in good faith way, to retain a lot of these players. But there really is no guarantee that they're going to do so. So the designated student athlete provision might actually, there's a wide range in outcomes between everyone gets grandfathered and nobody gets grandfathered. And I think we'll definitely be somewhere in the middle of that. But the question is where on that spectrum we're going to lie.
Well, so let me ask you. Last time you were here, we discussed the case of the Oklahoma women's golf player who kind of was made to transfer because they were going to be suffering from these roster limits. What would happen to that individual now that we have a finalized settlement?
Yeah, so Holly McLean is who you're talking about, who's now on the USF women's golf team. And I think she's a really good example. She was cut in November 2024, specifically because of the roster limits. Oklahoma getting ready to, very early getting ready to kind of build out the roster to reflect these roster limits. And she would have the right to transfer back to Oklahoma and be on Oklahoma's women's golf roster if she wanted to, but also only if Oklahoma would let her. So she would not. She does not have a guaranteed spot on Oklahoma's roster. If Oklahoma is willing to go over the roster cap, they can add her to the team, but there's no guarantee that they're going to be willing to do so, and there's nothing forcing her or forcing them to do so. But also, the same kind of goes both ways, where she does not have to transfer back. She could stay at UCF if she wants to.
Does the money that Oklahoma would be spending on her scholarship affect the money under the salary cap?
Not directly. It's not something where it would go against it. It would count against it, but it's money that's coming out of their budget. It's money that's coming out of their paycheck, and it became pretty clear as we kind of went through all the deliberations over roster limits and all the hammering over the roster limits that the motivation for a lot of these schools was, we need to cut expenses where we can, and that includes dropping down our roster sizes, and this was a way to do so. Even if, and for one, that's scholarships that you're no longer having to pay out for a lot of these athletes, but a lot of these athletes are walk-ons, so it's less money that you're cutting, but a little bit goes a long way.
Yeah. So let's talk about that money. The back pay we know is going to go predominantly to football and men's basketball student athletes um, during that window, 2016 to 2024. Uh, do we expect that to be exactly the same? Do we know kind of what percentages we're going to see in other sports?
That's the expectation. The expectation is, the way the back pay ended up working out, the way they're that they calculated based on Professor Rasher's formula, was about 85% going to football, about 10% going to men's basketball, and then the remainder going to a combination of women's basketball and the other sports. And based on what we've heard from the schools that have released their plans for revenue sharing, it seems like a lot of them are going to fit pretty neatly into that model, where again, 85% goes to football, 10% goes to men's basketball, and the remainder goes to women's basketball and other sports. I fully expect that will differ significantly depending on the sport. For one, I would imagine that at South Carolina and UConn, Don Staley and Gino are not going to take it too well if they're spending that much on football and kind of leaving these very popular, these very prolific women's basketball programs out in the cold. I imagine a lot of schools, based on their specialties, will devote more resources to that area. But other than that, like I would imagine that football is going to get the vast majority of this revenue, which I know a lot of people a lot of people in SEC land in particular are kind of wringing their hands over it because who has a big advantage over this, the Big East and other non-football sports who compete in basketball.
Yeah, and interestingly, I saw today Ross Dellinger had an article that was talking about how Kentucky was one of the schools that pushed back on possibly having set percentages or caps for each sport. So I think that
And that
fits,
makes a lot of sense.
yeah, with what you're saying about certain schools are going to be good at certain sports. The University of Minnesota, for example, has a really strong hockey program, both men's and women's hockey. I imagine that those sports are going to get some percentage here, although we don't necessarily know what percentage yet. Um, I know that another thing that we were talking about with roster limits was possibly the death of the walk on. Is that going to happen now? Are walk ons no more?
Well, it's not that walk-ons are no more. You can still have walk-ons. You can still very much do walk-ons. It's just that the need for walk-ons, kind of the designated walk-on, is no longer really a thing. Where, for example, you can have in football, for example, you can have 105 people on your roster, and the only difference now is that you can give all 105 of them scholarships. You don't have to have walk-ons, but I imagine a lot of schools are going to stick with 85 scholarships for football and have 20 non-scholarship walk-ons or preferred walk-ons or something like that. And I imagine in a lot of sports, like there have been a few programs who've come out and said we're gonna give scholarships to everyone in our athletic program. I think those programs are going to be in the minority. I think it's going to be very few programs who do that because, as you mentioned, as you mentioned before, these additional scholarships do count against the cap, and that's fewer dollars that you can give to these athletes directly, which is kind of a recruiting hit. But also, too, I think just from a resource perspective, a lot of schools are not going to be able to afford to give every member of their program a scholarship. So there's still going to be non-scholarship athletes throughout the variety of college sports.
Did Judge Wilkin talk about Title IX concerns? I know that was another thing that was brought up during the objections phase.
Very briefly, and really just in the context of those objections. And what she did, in her 76-page opinion, kind of granting or explaining her reasoning behind granting final approval, she did address kind of like going through each of the kind of different themes of objectors, kind of going through and kind of overruling each of them to find that she could grant final approval. And as far as Title IX is concerned, she's stuck to essentially what she's been talking about throughout, which is that Title IX, it might be a big issue. It might be something worth exploring. It might be something that a lot of people are going to have gripes and grievances about, and maybe justifiable gripes and grievances about. But it has to be something that's done through separate litigation. It's not something that's appropriate for this particular lawsuit and this particular settlement discussion.
So this settlement is not going to shut the door on possible future litigation as it relates to Title IX.
Absolutely not. In fact, Judge Wilkin was very clear that um, the parties may have, or the plaintiffs or others may have claims against the NCAA or against the schools. Against not the NCAA since they're exempt from Title IX, but against the schools for unevenly distributing revenue sharing dollars. And she wasn't going to give an opinion on whether she felt that they were subject to Title IX. And it won't be until we really won't know until we see it in front of a judge. And I imagine I would fully expect that lawsuit to come sometime around July 1st.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think similarly to how these plaintiffs were able to identify a judge who has an interest in upending the model, there's probably judges out there that are partial to those Title IX concerns. And I imagine that we are going to see those filings very shortly. I agree with you.
Eventually, yeah.
In the meantime, we do have a new body that is going to be overseeing the process and how all of this gets implemented. What do we know about the College Sports Commission and who's going to be in charge of that?
Yeah, so the College Sports Commission is essentially a new governing body, a new enforcement arm of the Power Four conferences. It's not affiliated with the NCAA directly. It's not something where the NCAA is running it, but it's something that the Power Four conferences are creating this to really implement the terms of the House settlement. And they've already chosen their new CEO. It's a man by the name of Brian Seeley. He was, I should say, an executive for Major League Baseball, where he was involved in a lot of their investigations, a lot of their conduct investigations, including most prominently the Houston Astros sign stealing scandal.
Oh.
Essence to say in a row. So he's someone who, he's a lawyer. He has a lot of experience in kind of conducting these investigations, and he actually had a feature piece with The Athletic earlier today where he talked about his vast experience working for kind of these enforcement arms that don't have subpoena power, that don't have the inherent right to call witnesses or things like that, and that's something that he's going to have to continue to be comfortable with, because unless there's some kind of federal legislation, which would be very interesting if it does grant this particular thing, he's not going to have subpoena power with the College Sports Commission.
Yeah, and so you mentioned that Seeley has this experience. Do you think that this signals that the Power Four schools are particularly serious about enforcing these rules and making sure that people aren't immediately trying to exploit workarounds?
I think it really does. I think they if that is their goal, they could not have picked a better person to do this. Because they picked someone who has really a lot of experience doing these investigations and really fighting these investigations and fighting on behalf of a league in these investigations. So I don't think they would hire someone like that if they were just going to kind of lie down and allow teams to kind of run over the cap as much as they want.
And so do you think that that type of enforcement mechanism is going to have more teeth than what we've seen out of the NCAA in the last several years?
I think the answer to that is the lawyer's favorite answer. It depends. Because I think out of the gate, the College Sports Commission, I think they're really going to try to assert their authority. I think they've signaled that they're going to really work to assert their authority very quickly and make it clear that they're kind of the new sheriffs in town, and they want these hardline rules, and they take these rules very seriously. But with that kind of action comes pushback. I mean, with every force, there's a counterforce, and here it's going to be lawsuits. I mean, it is unquestioned that there are going to be lawsuits over it, whether it's the players suing over the implementation of the cap, which Judge Wilkin, kind of surprising to me. I had not read the settlement release clause to read this, but she said in her opinion that the athletes retained the right under the release clause to file lawsuits for damages claims over the implementation of the revenue sharing cap.
Yes.
And I wonder if that's new information to the College Sports Commission and the Power Four conferences, but that is apparently something that they have the power to do.
She quite specifically said that the Power Four institutions should not use the settlement as a defense to antitrust.
Yeah, that too. That definitely too. I think her almost exact wording was, The NCAA and the conferences may try to make these arguments, but does not mean they will be successful, which I thought was a very Judge Wilkin thing to say, or a very Judge Wilkin way to put it. But yeah, we might see lawsuits from the players. Those might be consumed through arbitration, as Michael McCann has written about recently. But I also imagine we're going to see lawsuits from boosters and collectives because they are not parties to the settlement. They are not. They did not agree to be bound by its terms, and they have an interest in continuing to do what they were doing before, which is paying athletes to go to a particular school because they want that school to win, and they are going to be impacted pretty significantly because by being considered these associated entities and individuals, and they're going to, I imagine, it really only takes one. It only takes one of these boosters to file a lawsuit and say, this is unfair, this is not something that we signed up for. You are inhibiting our right to contract, you're inhibiting our right to enter in agreements on our own terms based on what we want. And it'll be really interesting to see how that lawsuit goes.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting today to see that Ohio State is basically bringing all of their three collectives under the same umbrella, and everything is going to be moving in house.
That's
And
right.
I wonder with Ross Bjork, mentioned him earlier, being such a prominent figure in the athletics administration space, if that's kind of signaling to the other schools like this is the way.
It wouldn't surprise me. I hadn't thought about it like that, but I think that's a good point.
Yeah. And so another piece of compliance and oversight that we have is the Deloitte Clearinghouse. And we've been hearing about this for some time, at least a few months. What do you make of this now? How does this fit in with College Sports Commission and NCAA and individual conferences, schools? How is this all going to work together?
Yeah, so it's very related to the powers that the College Sports Commission is asserting as far as their role in kind of avoiding cap circumvention and kind of pushing back against boosters and collectives who are working to sign athletes to deals that are what they feel are kind of circumventing the revenue sharing cap that the House settlement created. The clearinghouse is going to require all NIL deals over $600 to be submitted to this, and they're just going to investigate it to determine one, whether it is the way they phrased it within a reasonable range of compensation based on a variety of different factors, which is just their new fancier way of saying fair market value. And two, whether the deal is for a valid business purpose, which you can read as not being pay for play. Is it actually something where you're actually promoting or sponsoring a company as an athlete instead of just getting $1 million to do a couple of Twitter posts?
What did you think? I saw this online, and I wish I remembered who exactly said it because it was an interesting thought experiment. But what if you just had it be, you've got to make 1 million posts or something like that, something that's like unattainable because NIL Go, the Deloitte platform, is not necessarily going to be enforcing the delivery of the thing. Is it just like, once it reaches a point of being ludicrous that they could shut it down?
Yeah, it was Darren Heitner who said that,
Yeah.
which surprised absolutely nobody because he very much is strongly advocating for his players on a variety of different fronts, including against kind of the caps in the settlement and kind of the enforcement arm of the settlement. And yeah, I would fully imagine that that's going to be one of the ways that the commission is tested, and one of the ways that Deloitte is being tested here. And if a deal like that is signed and goes through and is rejected, there's probably going to be a fight over it. And I imagine Deloitte's going to come back and say, well, clearly this is something that is intended to look like it's for fair market value or look like it's for a valid business purpose, but there's clearly not an expectation of a performance here because nobody's going to do 1 million Twitter posts. And yeah, I think that's one of the many ways that we could see a legal fight over this.
Yeah, it is nice to know that there are people who are in the space that are already thinking about how they can work with the rules as they're currently set up. So you've got the NCAA or whatever's left of it. You've got Deloitte, NIL Go. You've got College Sports Commission. and Mr. Seeley. Is this as robust a framework as it seems like, or is this still kind of like a placeholder as the NCAA still tries to get a federal law done?
I think it's as robust a framework as it can be. The problem with doing this through a class action settlement as opposed to collective bargaining, which, as I'm sure your listeners know very well, collective bargaining in college sports is not an easy process. It's a very complicated process. It's one that there are so many different barriers and hurdles to climb before it can be a thing. I know a lot of people have advocated for it, and it's not nearly all that simple. But it, collective bargaining would be a very robust way to do this, a very kind of clear cut way to do this. And through class action settlement doesn't have nearly the legal protection and legal deference that a collective bargaining agreement would. So the College Sports Commission and NAL Go are set up as strong as they can be. They're set up to be as powerful as robust as they can be, but really at the end of the day, they're only as powerful as the law allows them to be. And right now, the law doesn't allow them, or potentially doesn't allow them to be all that powerful. I mean, we're gonna see tests to that strength, I imagine, very soon. And what I also would imagine, and in fact, we've already seen some reporting on it. Jesse Dowry posted a Washington Post article about some new federal legislation, a new federal bill that is going to be proposed this week at a hearing this week, that is really intended to fill in those gaps and really kind of strengthen the foundation of the College Sports Commission and of this enforcement arm, and really kind of fill in the holes that are created when you're doing this through a class action settlement instead of through collective bargaining.
And so, what is that proposed bill? Who's proposing it, and what kind of support do you think we're going to see from that in Washington?
Yeah, so my understanding is it's proposed by Brett Guthrie, who's a representative out of Kentucky. He is also the chair of, I'm pretty sure it's Commerce, which is the entity that's holding the hearing. And really, what it proposes is, as Jesse posted about and as Jesse kind of wrote about, it's very NCAA friendly. It's very kind of accommodating what they were looking to get. It allows for preemption of state law that conflicts with kind of NCAA passed rules and CSC passed rules and the House settlement in general. It codifies a lot of the settlement, as in really giving antitrust protection to a lot of the settlement in allowing, just like we talked about, how boosters and collectives are not parties to this. They could potentially file antitrust lawsuits over this. It would give antitrust protection to the CSC and the NCAA in defining what an associated entity or associated entity individual is, and kind of restricting their ability to enter into NIL deals with athletes that are not for fair market value and for valid business purpose. It would also allow the NCAA more latitude in promulgating eligibility rules, which is something that has been a major issue for them over the past few months, starting with the Diego Pavia lawsuit, which is currently under appeal at the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. And since then, we've seen, by my count, roughly 20 lawsuits by players seeking an additional year of eligibility, which is quite a lot, and something that I imagine the NCAA would like to tamp down on to the extent that they can. And federal legislation is one way to do it. And then finally, from what I read, it would also establish or give antitrust protection for the NCAA to establish an agent database and agent kind of enforcement arm that would go after agent abuses and require registration.
So you mentioned preemption, and I think that that's also part of it. We were discussing offline that there's a bill in Washington that seeks to kind of attack House's framework and make it so that the Washington Power 4 schools have to operate a little bit differently, right?
Yeah, this was one that was proposed a couple months ago, to my knowledge. I mean, time flies, so it might have been more recently than that. But it was a bill. It's a bill proposed by Representative Baumgartner out of Washington. It's clearly very much targeted towards the departing members of the Pac-12 who are now in other conferences and leaving Washington State and Oregon State out in the cold. And it would require revenue sharing among the different schools, so it wouldn't give schools in the SEC and the Big Ten who have very much higher media rights deals than other schools, a financial advantage, or at least as strong a financial advantage over other schools. And probably my favorite part of it is that it would require conferences to all be within one time zone, which I thought was. I actually set up on EA Sports CFP 25. I actually set up a new dynasty based on that framework. It's kind of fun to to list the different schools in these conferences based on that, because, like, for example, you can't have Alabama and Georgia in the same conference because Alabama's in the Central Time Zone and Georgia's in the Eastern Time Zone, and I don't know if Representative Bumgarner really thought about that, or maybe that's just a statement about having a conference that stretches from Seattle to Piscataway, New Jersey.
Yeah, but you could have Alabama and Minnesota, obviously way more related than Alabama and Georgia.
Oh, yeah. I didn't think about that one. I didn't include those in the same conference.
So you mentioned collective bargaining, and this sort of builds in a new system that does seem more like an employer-employee relationship. Do you think it's more likely now that we get collective bargaining, or less likely now that House has been approved?
I think a lot of people would disagree with me on this. I'm going to say less likely. I'm going to say that this kind of gets in the way of collective bargaining to a certain extent, just because it's a framework that exists now, and there's not as much that needs to be negotiated over. There's not as much incentive for either party to enter into a collective bargaining relationship. And incentive is really the key word here. Incentive is the all-important word here. What incentive for a while we've kind of talked about from the athlete's point of view, where what incentive do the athletes have to unionize and collectively bargain right now? And the answer is none, because they've been perfectly happy getting changes through litigation. And if they were to enter into a collective bargaining agreement, they wouldn't be able to do that anymore. You'd have the non-statutory labor exemption, which would exempt their antitrust claims against this collective bargaining agreement. And to be frank, depending on how the union looked, they'd probably have very little leverage in that union environment, in that negotiating environment. So I think it makes a lot of sense for them not to collectively bargain. As well, we also have, of course, the legal challenges that go into them potentially unionizing, which is, just the fact that state school as employers would not be subject to the National Labor Relations Act, but that's a different conversation. But also, now that we have the House settlement, we have the CSC, and we potentially have legislation that codifies the House settlement. What incentive do the schools have to enter into a collective bargaining relationship? And I'd submit the answer is, like with the players, not much. They got what they wanted through this class action settlement and potentially through federal legislation. And maybe it's not exactly what they wanted, but I can't imagine that collective bargaining would necessarily. I think you do that instead of getting federal legislation. If you're able to get federal legislation, that's always better. I mean, it's always better to get a antitrust exemption coming from Congress than having to actually bargain with the athletes and really deal with the hurdles that are involved with bargaining with the athletes. So,
yeah, despite the winding path that we've taken there, that's been plan A for the NCAA for about as long as I can remember.
Mm-hmm.
So let's close here. I got one more after this, but let's start to wrap up. Judge Wilkin, she's 75 years old. She's been, I think, one of the central figures in dismantling the amateur system that the NCAA relied upon for so long. O'Bannon in 2014, Alston in 2020, and now House. And so my question for you is Judge Wilkin the single most influential person in the transformation of college sports?
Yeah, I thought you were going to go with, is she the most important person in college sports, period? And I would have put her probably in the top 5 of that. But
yeah,
most important, is she the most important person in the transformation of college sports?
Yeah.
I'd still kind of put her in the top 5. I'm not sure that she is necessarily the person who is the central figure. I mean, she's obviously one of the key figures in this, just the way that she's made her decisions. But it's important to remember that the House settlement, like, she signed off on it. She blessed it. She gave final approval to it. But she didn't negotiate it. This is not something that she would have done. I mean, she decided O'Bannon, she decided Alston, um, at least in the beginning, because they're both appealed, O'Bannon to the Ninth Circuit and Alston to the Ninth Circuit and the Supreme Court. She is certainly, and this is not meant to minimize her impact on this whole thing, because she is one of the most impactful people in the history of college sports, period. Like, I wouldn't even include the transformation in that, but I think a lot of credit has to be given to the lawyers in this as well. Like, I know I've had my criticisms of Steve Berman and Jeffrey Kessler on this. I know a lot of people have had their criticism over it, just feeling like the settlement could have been better, or the settlement is a poor trade, or the settlement is kind of just bad in general. But they're the ones who pushed for this. They're the ones who negotiated this. They're the ones who are really set up the litigation in the first place, and were willing to take the risk on the litigation in the first place. And even going back to the Alston case, I mean, successfully arguing the Alston case is huge as well. So they definitely need to be considered within that as well.
Yeah, agreed. Definitely the Winston and Strawn lawyers there, they hugely involved in this. So let's close quickly here. Give me your biggest winners and your biggest losers, how settlement gets finalized.
The biggest winners by far, not even close, are Power 4 football and men's basketball players, and to a lesser extent women's basketball players as well. They get significant back pay for damages related to NIL, stretching back to 2016. I mean, the athletes pre-2016 are not nearly in as good of a position, especially now that the Chalmers litigation got kicked due to the statute of limitations concerns. But that's a whole different conversation. But now, not only are they getting the back pay, but they're also, the current athletes are able to get paid directly by the schools, and that's huge for them. That is gigantic for them. That is a complete paradigm shift in college athletics, and they're certainly the beneficiaries of it first and foremost. I'd say also Power 4 schools are going to be winners on this, because they have the ability to do this. They have the ability to compete in this market. And for them, there is a cap here. There is, some semblance of competitive balance here, and one that favors them over lower tier schools who are not able to. Who, for them, the cap doesn't even matter. The cap could be, $500 million instead of $20.5 million, and it wouldn't matter because they're not going to reach it. And it gives the Power 4 schools who are already saying, we're going to pay the full amount every year, an advantage over the schools who are not going to be able to. And I shouldn't even say all Power 4 schools in there, because some Power 4 schools have already come out and said, we're not paying the full 20.5. We don't have the money to pay the full 20.5. I'm pretty sure Cal said they're paying somewhere around $9 million. So yeah, but the schools that are able to pay that are big winners here. And then for some losers, or first, one more winner on this, the attorneys for the Winston Tron attorneys and Berman's firm, they are big winners here, because they're getting a lot of money in billable hours, and they get to be done with this. They don't have to worry about this anymore. They've signed away their rights to sue over future stuff, pretty much. So,
what kind of future stuff? Like, there could be another case theoretically in the future.
There could be. I'm pretty sure they're of the opinion that they just don't need to do it, or they just don't need to test it further. Maybe they will get involved with more things, but they certainly don't have to. I think that's kind of the key takeaway.
That wasn't the sense that I got from hearing Jeff Kessler speak at
really?
Sports Lawyers Association, but yeah, we'll see. I mean, maybe they'll give it a rest for a little bit and see how this develops, and then go from there.
Maybe I'm just being cynical. Like, I'm probably just being cynical. Like, that's a very fair read of this situation. But yeah, and then some losers. I think the biggest one is the athletes who were cut because of roster limits. Like, I feel for them. Yeah. So many of these stories were just heartbreaking to hear. And I think people underestimate how, what kind of an impact that has. Like, there are a lot of athletes who were cut, who were on scholarship, and who are no longer going to be able to finish their collegiate programs, because they just don't have the money to pay for it anymore. And I really feel for them. I really feel for those situations, and even just the situations where they're just not able to play their sport anymore. And the designated student athlete label, I I really think it's going to end up being kind of a very um, uh, poor substitute for kind of mandatory grandfathering. And mandatory grandfathering was never going to happen. But the designated student athlete label, I don't think. I think it relies far too much on the good faith of schools who have already who very almost all of them have already acted on their roster limits. And what incentive do they have to go back on this? And the answer is none. Or not none real, no real incentive. But I don't know. We'll see how it shakes out. I might be pleasantly surprised.
Yeah.
But also another loser on this. I mean, you have to say Olympic sports. You have to say
that would be my biggest sports,
just because there's going to be fewer resources to be able to be spread to them now, and that's something where maybe finally the USOC is going to have to step in and protect their interests in this and stop relying on the free labor of college football players and college basketball players to fund Olympic sports at the collegiate level and fund essentially where training programs for the USOC. And
yes,
I'm very much in favor of that, even if it might hurt for the next few years.
Yeah, well, hopefully they can get it together before 2028, because
I agree.
Or 2026, I guess we got a winter. But I love seeing us at the top of the medal count. It's pretty important to me. So I am hopeful that somebody gets together and realizes that that's important. So Sam, you've done such a great job covering this story, but you're not going away. You'll still be a key figure in college sports as far as I'm concerned. Where can people see what you're posting about and read your work?
Well, that's far too kind of words for me. I don't know if I quite meet that, but I really appreciate the sentiment. You can find me on Twitter or Blue Sky. I'm under the username Sam C. Ehrlich, SAMCEHRLSCH, both of them. And I also have a website, the College Sports Litigation Tracker, which is collegesportslitigationtracker.com. If you want to, sadly, not going to have any more updates on the house. A little bit of a bittersweet moment, Definitely sweet to not worry about those updates anymore. But kind of like losing a friend to a certain regard. But still, plenty of eligibility lawsuits to track. In fact, tomorrow I'm flying up to Montana to witness in person one of these lawsuits. Kai Johnson, a Montana basketball player, his eligibility lawsuit, a preliminary injunction hearing on it. So, be very curious to see what happens there, and very curious to see what happens in all these other lawsuits, including the appeals of the Paddy case and the Forkland case and the ELAD case, and of course as well all the other cases that are still working their way through the district court system as well.
Yeah, but I don't think the words are too kind. You're a great follow, and I hope that everyone will check that out. Thanks, everyone, for listening. This episode is always brought to you by Themis Bar Review. Themis, best bar review company in the galaxy. If you use our code CD800, you can save some money. Let them know that Conduct sent you. For myself, for Sam, for the Dans, and our entire group, thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time on another episode of Conduct Detrimental.